right, great. As people start rolling in, welcome. We'll get the conversation started. So thank you everyone for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're calling in. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us for today's discussion, especially in these very unusual times that we find ourselves in. Firstly, we hope that all of you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy wherever you may be. We really appreciate how now more than ever, it's important to connect and engage virtually with each other as much as we can. And we hope that today really lends itself to an interactive discussion with valuable insight. It is, of course, a webinar. You will notice that you are muted, but we do encourage you to engage with us in a discussion through the chat feature as we go along. So today we're going to be talking about how in the last 30 years, really, plastic pollution has gone from a relatively minor concern to a pretty major crisis. And we're fortunate enough to hear from two different business leaders on the subject who are tackling the plastic waste challenge from two different perspectives. So with us today, we have Matthew Slavic from Morgan Stanley. He's the managing director and head of Morgan Stanley's Global Sustainable Finance Group, where he focuses on mobilizing private sector capital to address major global challenges, including plastic waste. And you'll hear from Matthew about Morgan Stanley's plastic waste resolution. It's actually the 1-year anniversary today of that resolution, so great timing. We also have Greg Riddle joining us from Eastman Chemical Company. Greg is the VP of Investor Relations and Corporate Affairs there. Eastman Chemical is a global specialty chemical company that produces a broad range of advanced materials, additives and functional products, specialty chemicals and fibers that are found in products people use every day. So Eastman really focuses on delivering innovative and technology-based solutions while maintaining a commitment to safety and sustainability. At Eastman, Greg is responsible for managing their corporate communications, government affairs, public policy, public affairs, and of course, investor relations threads. Definitely quite a bit there. So thank you both for joining us. Today, what we're going to be talking about, next slide please, are a few key discussion points. But before we get into that, just quick housekeeping. As I'd mentioned earlier, please do interact with us and the panelists. You can use the Zoom chat box or you can tweet us online at Twitter at this handle. If you have any technical difficulties, please just chat us or email us at marketing@datamaran.com and one of my colleagues will be in touch with you. We are recording the webinar, so we will distribute the recording afterwards. Today's key discussion points are really looking at, why are we here? Why are we talking about the plastic waste challenge? And who needs to be involved in that discussion? We'll hear specifically from Greg about how Eastman is integrating circular economy models into their value creation and risk management strategies. We'll hear from Matthew about how the capital markets can really help to scale solutions across the plastics value chain. And we'll also consider the role that technology plays, specifically in engineering to make solutions more scalable and sustainable, but also in terms of ensuring we have reliable information to guide decision-making and investment strategies. So before we dive into a discussion, I'll just set the stage. And before we do that, I'll just give a quick introduction to Datamaran for those of you that may not be too familiar with who we are and why we are interested in the subject of plastic waste. Well, Datamaran is a fully automated digital solution for identifying and monitoring external risks. It's one of the only software available to support a data-driven and dynamic business process for monitoring the regulatory, reputational, and strategic risk drivers around ESG issues, like plastic waste and circular economy. So companies worldwide like Eastman and Morgan Stanley use Datamaran to inform their materiality reporting and decision-making processes. So we really come to this discussion from the perspective of supporting companies with a digitally enabled process for monitoring different stakeholder views on key ESG issues, but also in terms of capturing reliable information to inform decision-making. So monitoring stakeholder views is actually a really important point of this discussion. because there are different stakeholders who are involved in influencing this discussion from a business perspective, from a civil society perspective, and from a regulatory perspective. Next slide, please. One thing to keep in mind for today's discussion is we're really focusing the discussion on plastic waste and enabling a circular system. Of course, there are many beneficial uses of plastic, as we are seeing right now in the current coronavirus pandemic. But really what we're focusing on for today are the challenges and solutions in managing plastic waste and enabling a circular economy. So I was speaking earlier to the different types of stakeholders that are really influencing this discussion. Next slide, please. What we're starting to see is that there are shifting norms around plastic waste, and these are really being influenced by consumer preferences, media, and global civil society movements, such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's New Plastics Economy Initiative and the resulting European Plastics Pact. We're also seeing similar types of collaborations with the World Economic Forum's Global Plastic Action Partnership. What we're also starting to see is that there are several countries, regions, and cities that are starting to introduce regulations and legislations focused specifically on plastic. Most of these are primarily aimed at the use and disposal to reduce consumption and improve waste management, but we're also starting to see policies that are directly targeting the primary production of plastics. Some recent examples you'll see here on the screen. So for instance, we've seen the EU Parliament voted to ban single-use plastics by 2021. We also see that the United Nations has amended the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste to include plastic waste, introducing new legal standards. We're also seeing, though, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of attention being placed on companies themselves. So most recently, in February, there was the Break Free from Pollution Act introduced to the US Congress. And this is really a comprehensive piece of legislation that is being hailed as really one of the first of its kinds attempts to address the root causes of the crisis on the national level in the United States. These are just a few examples of what we're seeing in terms of, the influence of civil society, of consumers, of regulators on the discussion, particularly around the role that businesses play. And we're starting to see that businesses are responding. Next slide, please. So here, what we're looking at is really the evolution of corporate disclosure on plastic waste and single-use plastics. This is a graph pulled from Datamaran, where we analyze corporate reports of companies globally, over 7,000 companies worldwide, and we're really looking for references to plastic waste and single-use plastics. We can see that there's really been an exponential growth in disclosure around plastic waste. Particularly, this is by publication year. So if we look at 2019 publications, that there's just been an exponential growth in attention being placed on the issue by businesses. And what we're also starting to see is that the majority of this discussion is actually taking place in financial reports and SEC filings. So that's just a breakdown of the report types in which we see these disclosures taking place in 2019 specifically. We also see a similar trend when we look at disclosure around circularity and circular economy. Next slide, please. So we can see that there's been a consistent growth here. Of course, disclosure is backward looking, but what this really shows is how issues that may be financially immaterial today can quickly become so tomorrow. And this is why we need different types of business leaders involved in the discussion. And this is also why it's really important for businesses to be able to monitor different changing stakeholder expectations. This idea of monitoring, next slide please, is really starting to become a more mainstream sentiment. Recently, the World Economic Forum published a thought leadership piece about embracing what they call the new age of materiality. What they do in this paper is really reinforce this idea that certain issues can emerge as financially material very quickly in the changing external landscape. And they actually call out plastic waste as an illustrative example that speaks to the importance of businesses really having a dynamic approach to monitoring changing external stakeholder expectations and using technology to support that. So I hope that helped to set the stage a bit. We're going to dive into a discussion now with our experts, Greg and Matthew. Before we do, we just want to get a pulse check from you. We have quite a few people joining us today. So we'd like to understand, what is your level of understanding on the topic? So we have a poll that will pop up on your screen, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to respond to that poll. In terms of your options, you can say, I'm completely green, just learning about the subject. I have some basic knowledge. I have a pretty solid background, or you may be an expert. So we'll give you a moment to respond there so we can get a check on who's with us today. All right, great. So the responses are in. It looks like the majority of those joining us have some basic knowledge or a solid background. So not too many who are completely green, although some, and not too many who would consider themselves an expert. All right. Thank you for joining us, everybody. So with that, I'm going to dive into a discussion with Matthew and Greg. And really, before we hear specifically about their initiatives at their companies, we just want to talk about the role of innovation in reimagining the plastics economy. And when we talk about innovation, we can talk about it from many angles. We can talk about it from using technology to scale solutions, to ensure data transparency, but also in terms of, really having the stakeholder approach across the plastics value chain to scale these types of solutions. So thinking about that, Matthew, I'll kick it off with you. Morgan Stanley is the only major financial institution to have a plastic waste initiative, which launched 1 year ago to the day. How do you see your role, specifically at Morgan Stanley, but also broadly, the capital markets, in helping to scale innovative solutions across the plastic waste value chain?
Susie, first and foremost, thank you very much for having us on today's webinar and for hosting this. And I hope that everybody on the other side of their cameras and computers are healthy and doing well, and the families are in the same place. It's interesting because Morgan Stanley, we're not a big user of plastics. We're not a producer of plastics. But we took a step back a little over a year ago to start thinking about some of the major challenges that face the world. Plastic waste was something that jumped out. And again, this is not about plastics. I think there are many, many, many great uses of plastic. And frankly, the reason that plastic is so great also makes plastic waste such a challenge in terms of the durability of the material, the lightweightness or lightweight ability to, as well. And so we took a step back, and as a challenge, it is really a systemic challenge. Solving the plastic waste challenge is going to require innovation. It's going to require innovation from everything from basic materials through last mile capture. There's no silver bullet to solve this. And as a company, we are very active across all industries around the world, and believe that we have a really unique role to play in helping connect capital to solutions, and working with our clients and our partners to really help further new approaches to plastic waste. So that's why Morgan Stanley tackled this. And you're right, it is a fortuitous date to be having this webinar, since it was a year ago today that Morgan Stanley made our large public waste resolution commitment.
Thank you, Matthew. And thinking about actual solutions, Greg, Eastman Chemical has really embedded circularity into your business model. So could you just talk a little bit to that? What is the circular economy model, and how does it factor into this plastic waste crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Susie, and I'd like to echo Matt's appreciation for you setting up this webinar and for the topic that we're discussing today. And I'd also like to express my hope that everybody is healthy and safe and doing everything that they can to keep that in place. So for Eastman, yes, the circular economy, the concepts of the circular economy are embedded into what it is that we're doing. And I want to build off of something that Matthew said. It's going to take innovation across the value chain in order for us to effectively address this issue. Eastman definitely has a role to play, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes in terms of the innovations and technologies that we have and the contribution that we can make. But by no means are we going to be sufficient to address this issue. So there's going to need to be innovation and partnerships across industries. There's going to be innovation at the brand owner level. There's going to be innovation that's necessary with the recycling system that we have today. And we're going to need new ways to think about things. And as we partner across the value chain in order to think about that innovation and consider how we can together improve the value chain within the concept of the circular economy, that's where we're going to make progress. And so as Eastman thinks about this and works on this and continues to develop and expand the technologies that we have today, we're thinking about it in the context of the value chain more broadly. So this isn't just specific to us. We have a role to play, and again, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but this is a broader challenge that folks like Morgan Stanley, the brand owners that have made commitments, the recycling industry itself, all need to contribute so that we can address this in the way that we all want.
Absolutely. And, diving into that value chain discussion that you both speak to, Matthew and Greg, which types of stakeholders have you seen have been really pivotal in influencing the discussion? Of course, in the beginning, I mentioned consumer, civil society, regulators, and how do you engage with these different types of stakeholders? That's a question to both of you. So Matthew, if you'd like to respond first.
Sure. I think you're seeing engagement across the stakeholder spectrum, just like you are across the value chain in terms of, creating and using plastics. I think, obviously consumer preferences, and again, there are some very, very good uses for plastics and single-use plastics, and I think we just need to be thoughtful about how we help tackle the crisis. I think, as you pointed out, obviously regulatory regimes around the world are starting to take notice and really step up their focus. Also, some GPAB from the World Economic Forum, which we're a member of, stepping in to really help share best thinking. EMF, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and the nonprofit world increasingly focused on circular economy and doing some really great research and kind of coordination across stakeholders. And I think, yes, I think investors as well. I think as information continues to become available, and I thought your chart that you showed around mentions in disclosures was fascinating, because I think this is definitely a topic that we've heard from our clients, whether they're individual or institutional investors or corporate clients, and really seeing that play out. And as that body of information continues to expand, I think you're going to see that information play a bigger role. So I'd say broadly across all of our stakeholders.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I mean, we're certainly engaged with NGOs. Ellen MacArthur Foundation is an example. We're engaged with policymakers globally, so not just here in the US, but most certainly in Europe as well. We're engaged with our peers in trade associations that we belong to. So Consumer Brands Association would be an example of that. And this is an important issue for our employees as well. I think that they're a key stakeholder also. They want us to contribute to the solution here and take great pride in our ability to do so. So we're engaged with all of those folks. And then, again, I can't emphasize enough, there's a recycling infrastructure that is built here in the US, in Europe, and in Asia. It's changing, lots of different reasons why that's the case. We all know that's true. And so we're engaged with them as well as we think about getting recycled material to our facilities in order to have the chemical recycling technologies to have a feedstock for that. That's an important part of this as well, and having a value for that plastic waste is critical. And working with all of these different stakeholders and helping them understand how important that is as a part of the solution is also part of the engagement that we're involved with.
Great. Yeah, you both brought up two, interesting points there in terms of the engagement piece. It's important to share information, one about what you're doing publicly, but also have ways to capture and consume that information, like looking at corporate reports, for instance, to understand how companies are being committed to that. Before, when we were talking about this webinar, we were talking about the role that technology plays on one hand in ensuring data transparency, but also in terms of, the specific engineering of solutions. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that in terms of the types of technological innovations that you're both seeing from those two different perspectives.
Yeah, so I don't want to take too much away from what I'm going to say in a few minutes, but
Sure.
we do have a couple of technologies that we think can make a meaningful contribution to this issue. And it's something where we have really decades of experience with this technology, and it's just using it in a different way in order to be applicable to the subject that we're talking about now. And so we've made great progress in going from this being an idea to now being at commercial scale, which is where we are today. And the potential for that to grow exponentially is in front of us as there continues to be momentum around what it is that we're doing. And so there's innovation on all of the different steps within the technologies that we have. And again, we are innovating and working with and partnering with a variety of stakeholders, as we were talking about just a moment ago. We feel like we're well positioned because we had some technologies that could be adapted to this issue and positions us to make a meaningful contribution. And you can do it right now. This isn't something you have to wait for. We're not in a pilot stage. We're at commercial scale today. And that in and of itself, I think, is meaningful for this debate, to help people understand that there are technologies that are scaled today, that are at commercial scale and can make this contribution, and are making this contribution right now. We have products in the market with customers that are using recycled content from our carbon renewal technology. That's happening today. And so you don't have to wait. It's happening now. And it's now just a matter of, can we all get together and scale this up? And that's where the innovation will come in.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think your question actually made me realize that there was a key group of stakeholders that we inadvertently left out of our answer, which is academic institutions. And look at the work that Jenna Jambak is doing at Georgia, organizations like National Geographic Society. I think there's a lot that's really coming out of the University of Michigan. We've actually partnered with all three of those organizations in different ways as part of our resolution, and specifically as it relates to technology. Jenna has helped develop an application to basically put citizen science in everybody's pocket, called the Marine Debris Tracker, which is really helping pave the path going forward to help track the flow of plastic waste, to be able to help design better solutions, and in partnership with National Geographic as well. The second answer around technology from a Morgan Stanley perspective, I think really focuses on an example of trying to get more information into investors' hands to help them make more informed decisions around all sorts of issues, but plastic-based waste obviously being the one we're discussing today. And it makes me think of an application that Morgan Stanley launched in the second half of last year called Morgan Stanley IQ, which is a tool to really help our clients identify the core issues that they focus on that's important to them from a mission perspective, and then help them understand portfolio alignment and how aligned their portfolios and investment decisions are to the things that they most care about. And I'll tell you that plastic waste is a conversation and a topic that continually kind of comes to the top of the list. And we all know that the sort of information that's available is, let's say, new and developing. And so maybe limited information that's truly available today, even though it looked like a huge hockey stick increase in mentions, but I think that being able to plug information into tools like that going forward will really help inform decision making at scale.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point, Greg, there are solutions. So talking about those solutions, making them accessible, to your peers, but also to your investors is important in terms of attracting capital. And then Matthew being able to easily access that information is critically important as well. Great. I want to then, dive into the specific resolution that you have, Matthew, at Morgan Stanley around plastic waste, and Greg, then we can move on to the specific technologies that you're actually using at Eastman to really embed circularity into your business model. Obviously, we've had a big discussion now on the different types of stakeholders that need to be engaged in really pushing the plastic waste crisis and tackling the challenge that we face. So we have another poll for our attendees. In your opinion, who do you think will lead the way in accelerating innovative plastic waste solutions? Investors in the capital markets, corporate leaders, regulators and policymakers, other covering quite a big group of consumers, nonprofits, civil society organizations, or really you need all of the above? I think we're seeing an unsurprising result here in the polling responses. Okay, great. Thank you for responding. I know we didn't capture everybody's responses. They're rolling in right now, but it looks like the majority of you are saying we need all of the above, which is great, in line with the World Economic Forum's theme of stakeholder capitalism for this year. But also it seems like there's an emphasis on corporate leaders as well as regulators and policymakers. So let's dive in now. Matthew, would love to hear a bit more about the plastic waste resolution specifically and how that's helping to scale solutions.
Sure. Thank you. Go to the next slide. No need to stare at that photo. Great. So thank you. So, as we mentioned, Morgan Stanley a year ago today made a large commitment around plastic waste, specifically committing to prevent, reduce, and remove 50 million metric tons of plastic waste from entering rivers, oceans, landscapes, and landfills by 2030. We feel like that's a pretty bold and challenge to help tackle. And as I talked about before, believe that we are, as a large financial institution with clients across the spectrum, sort of uniquely positioned to do this. And I would just say this doesn't come out of nowhere for us. Sustainability and sustainable finance has been a major part of our firm for many years. My team was actually formed over 10 years ago to really formalize this effort across the firm, and trying to tackle large challenges in the sustainability space to provide solutions for our clients, connect capital with those solutions, and do so at a scale like in the capital markets has been something that has really been a tenet of how we've focused on sustainability and sustainable finance for many years. Next slide, please. So I think we've alluded to this, and this is just one of potentially many graphs out there that shows the increase of plastic waste since 1950. I think the stat is something like 50% of all plastic waste has been generated since the year 2000. This isn't an age-old problem. This is a relatively new age challenge, and it's not just an environmental challenge either. I think there's a stat that about a dump truck of plastic a minute is dumped into the ocean. It's also an economic challenge, and clearly that resonates with our firm and our client base, that $100 billion a year is estimated from plastic packaging alone to leave the economy. And so how can we think about trying to keep that capital in the economy, that value in the economy, to really drive forward? Next slide, please. A special thanks to our friends at Encourage Capital for putting this together in their report a few years ago. But I think it really exemplifies and articulates the sort of scope and scale of the challenge across industries, and maybe more so than the challenge, the solutions. And it's very clear, the poll articulated, I think it's been a major tenet of this conversation as well, is that this isn't a silver bullet challenge. It's going to take innovation and to scale across material engineering, product design, human behavior, collection, recycling technologies, last chance capture. It's really going to take an end-to-end solution or many solutions to really help tackle this. It's hard, you can't point a finger at one particular point of this and say if we could only solve that, the rest of everything would fall into place. But it's really quite a broad challenge at the industry level and at the global level. Next slide, please. And so what does this mean for Morgan Stanley? It's all well and good to talk about a large commitment around 50 million tons, but how do you actually start to mobilize capital towards those solutions? And so our approach has really been to activate every part of our firm, from to your point about employees, Greg, really thinking about how we could change behavior in our offices and remove single-use plastics from our operations, but more so to how we could really serve our clients at a large scale. It's about underwriting new innovative financing, like what we did for Pepsi at the end of last year to help them reduce their dependence on virgin plastic, or working with our investment banking clients or our wealth management clients to really help sort of create solutions and allocate capital. In wealth management last year, we launched a suite of low minimum portfolios to really help everybody who's a client of Morgan Stanley Wealth Management invest in a way that supports SDG 14, among others, which is focused on ocean health. As well as activating partnerships like the University of Michigan that I mentioned, Jenna Jamback and the University of Georgia and National Geographic. And then one thing that I find particularly exciting is Morgan Stanley and Kellogg have run the Kellogg Morgan Stanley Sustainable Investing Challenge, which really seeks to engage the next generation of leaders in finance to think about sustainability and product design. And we're actually right in the midst of our competition this year. The finals are tomorrow. We've done a special call for ideas around plastic waste from business school students around the world, and 2 of the 4 finalists are actually focused on plastic solutions. So really it's about how we can activate every part of our business, how we can innovate within our business and for our clients to really help bring solutions to scale. And then I think the next slide is just disclosures, so we'll skip it. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Matthew. I think to your point there are some really key elements that resonated, particularly that this is not just an environmental challenge; it is an economic challenge. That's a very important takeaway. So with that, Greg, I will pass it on to you.
Yeah, that's great. If we could just go to the next slide, please. So, Susie, you did a nice job of giving an overview of who Eastman is, but there might be some people on this webinar that are not familiar with the company. The first thing I'd point out in the bottom right is that this is our centennial. So Eastman has been around for 100 years. And we think our participation in the circular economy is going to be an important part of our next 100 years. Next thing I'll point out is on the bottom there, you can see what our corporate purpose is, enhancing the quality of life in a material way. That's a lens through which we look for just about everything it is that we do, from the products that we make to the safety that we embed into our culture to the integrity that we have as a company. We think very, very carefully about how we're enhancing the quality of life in a material way. Last thing I'll point to on this slide is, as you look across it, you're not seeing a lot of packaging. That is really not an important business for us, low single digits as a % of our revenue. Really, you're seeing durable products across the pictures that you're seeing here, or you're seeing things that go into consumables like food, feed, and ag, obviously an important part for us to contribute. You go to the next slide, please. So as we think about our role in the circular economy and what it is that we can do, we start with how the world is changing. And what we're giving you here is just a few global brands that have made some pretty significant commitments on the percent of their products that are going to have recycled content, or how much of their products how much recycled content is going to be in their products. This is just a snapshot. There are many others, and there are others that have made commitments well beyond what you're seeing here. My point is that as these commitments are being made, the infrastructure for responding to these commitments is in the process of being built. It doesn't exist today. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but it means that there does need to be this innovation that we've talked about in order for these brands to meet the commitments that they're making. And you can see 2025, it's not a lot of time to get to what it is that they're looking for. And so it's important that the efforts that Morgan Stanley is doing, the efforts that Eastman is doing, and the many other efforts that there are in this area, that we accelerate as much as we can, so that we can get to where we all want to be and what we've committed to do. Go to the next slide, please. So when we think about recycling, typically we think about mechanical recycling. That's been around for a long time. And my point today is that chemical recycling is not in competition with mechanical recycling, it's complementary to. In order to get to what we just talked about in terms of the commitments that brands are making, you're going to need both of these. And there's a lot of good in mechanical recycling in terms of its greenhouse gas footprint, the energy consumption that you have there, but there's some limitations as well. There's only so many different types of plastics that you can use. As you're doing mechanical recycling, there's degradation in the performance of the products that come out the back end. And there's a finite amount of processing that you can have. There's only so many times that you can put a plastic through a mechanical recycling loop because there's degradation in that performance. So it's an important part of the recycling infrastructure, but it's only a part. Chemical recycling is also an important part of the recycling infrastructure. We will only have chemical recycling technologies that improve the greenhouse gas footprint against the existing technologies. So there has to be an improvement in the greenhouse gas footprint. One of the things that we think is exciting about chemical recycling is that you can use a broad range of products. So for our polyester technology, renewal technology, there's a variety of different plastics that you can use, where for mechanical recycling, there's only a few. When you do mechanical recycling, at the end, the end product is indistinguishable from a virgin product. So for example, you can use it in food contact applications, you can use it in medical applications, because it is essentially the same as what you started with. And then you can do this infinitely. So it truly is a circular technology, in that you can keep doing this loop over and over and over again, and you continue to have that indistinguishable performance. You can go to the next slide, please. So I want to acknowledge that the industry has been slow to develop these technologies. Some of the slides that you've seen, one of the slides that Matthew showed, and one of the slides that Susie showed, we haven't been as quick as we could have. With that being said, I think the industry has figured that out, and I think that innovation is now moving quickly. What I do want to emphasize is that for some technologies, you don't have to wait. You can be at commercial scale today, and that's where we are. You go to the next slide, please. So I've alluded to two technologies, a carbon renewal technology and a polyester renewal technology. Essentially what you're doing is you're taking waste plastic at the front end of the process, using that as a feedstock, breaking that down to its molecular components, and then getting to the end product, which is a plastic pellet. Or something to that effect. And you can see the products that it goes into today. So for example, the CDA Renew goes into ophthalmolics, or our Naya Renew goes into textiles. From the polyester, you can see the Eastman Crystal Renew is going into, for example, cosmetics packaging, or the Triton is going into water bottles. You're looking for applications where the combination of the performance and the recycled content are important to the end consumer. And again, these are all areas where we can take these products, put them in the front end, and at the back end have a product that's indistinguishable from the virgin product at the beginning. These are working today. We are partnering with brand owners in a variety of different areas. Some of these are public and some of these aren't public yet. They're scalable. So we're at commercial scale today, and we're only at the beginning of that. There's the opportunity for us to expand beyond the manufacturing capability that we have in Kingsport. And I want to reemphasize the importance of partnering with and working with the recycling infrastructure in order to get the product that we need, that we'll use as our feedstock in the front end. We need to be able to get that to our facilities in order to use it as a feedstock in these technologies. So it's really, really important that we continue to partner with the recycling infrastructure as well. So we're here today. You can do this, as the title says, you can do it right now. We're working with people today. So, you know, I want to give people hope that there are technologies scalable today at commercial scale that we're working today to try and solve this issue. So thank you.
Great, thank you both. And we've been receiving quite a few questions actually from the audience throughout your discussions. So I think now is a good time to get to some of those questions. Anyone who has yet to ask a question but would like to ask a question, there is a Q&A feature on Zoom that you can use to pose those questions. And I'm just going to be reading through them, and we'll do our best to get to those. But, you know, thank you, Greg, to your point about, you know, using and adapting existing technologies and products. I think it's a very important one, and about scaling innovation and really, you know, just diving in and getting those solutions out there and improving in an iterative way as you go. Really important in terms of, you know, the pace of change that we need right now in order to really meet our broader climate related goals. So thinking about that, and looking at, you know, the actual back end and front end, there is a question here about investor perceptions towards solutions that tackle reduction at the source as compared to solutions that increase the end of pipe recycling. So Matthew and Greg, are you seeing any shift in terms of investor focus on plastic recycling to reducing consumption at the source?
I guess maybe I'd answer that in two ways. One is, you know, there's a bit of a, you know, at the end of life, right? There's something you can touch and feel, whether it's a, you know, a water bottle or something like that. So I think there's sort of a personal, I don't want to call it connection, but to that. And I think that when people think about single-use plastics and straws and bottles and packaging, it's something very physical. I think what we're seeing actually, and I think we talked a lot about this today, is that it's not any one thing. It is not just about end of life. It is not just about design and collection. It is front to back, start to finish, about everything from material design to last mile capture. And there has to be solutions across all of that. There are opportunities across all of that. There's innovation that has to happen across all of that. I think Greg talked about a lot of the great work that Eastman is doing in the space. And so I think from investor perception, you know, I think it's really across the board.
Yeah, if I put on my investor relations hat and think about the conversations that we've had with investors as we talk through this technology and what it is that we've done, it's really more about how we as a company contribute to a circular economy and the momentum that circular economy has and the impact that that'll have on companies, good and bad. And so for us, it's just helping people, educating people about what it is that we're doing and the impact that it could have both on enabling a circular economy and then on Eastman specifically. So it's not necessarily, at least in the conversations that we've had, about reducing the use of products and that being an important point for the investors that we engage with, but rather it's how we're helping to enable a circular economy.
And
yeah.
Greg, go Go for it.
I was going to say one other thing to add. I think maybe less about sort of front to back, but I would say that we've talked a lot about investors, we've talked a lot about sort of corporations, and we've talked about the regulatory environment. What we haven't talked a ton about is around the municipalities, at least here in the U.S., that are really thinking about this as part of their infrastructure, both in terms of obviously serving their constituents, but as they invest in new projects, as they think about waste collection, processing. I think this is a theme that is really important and integrated into how municipalities, and we're definitely seeing that through our public finance conversations as well.
Yeah, that's great, Matthew. There was actually a question about that in terms of, what's the best way to really inform the general public about the reality of the severity of the situation. So it's, I think to your point, this is where academics are, taking a role and getting tools and technologies out to general public. Municipalities obviously taking a very big step forward. And there's actually a question here that's relatively timely in terms of, the current situation we find ourselves in with the coronavirus pandemic. What impact do you see that having on the plastic waste and plastic reuse discussion? Do you think it's helping to shine a light and accelerating innovation? Obviously, there's different ways to interpret that.
Well, as the economy has dramatically slowed here, what I would say is the engagement that we have with stakeholders in a variety of areas have not slowed down. In fact, in some places they've accelerated. There continues to be a significant amount of interest in moving forward with circular economy solutions. And so at least that's been the experience that we've had. And so I find a lot of confidence in seeing that in a time where there are a lot of companies, big and small, that are under a lot of pressure, that this continues to be top of mind in an area of focus for companies. Mm-hmm. But it is being done in a demand environment that is challenging on many, many different levels. I don't even think we've fully understood yet what the extent of the challenge is going to be. And so you're managing within that context. And so ultimately that might mean that while there continues to be a lot of interest in moving forward, actually getting that to the finish line is going to be a little bit slower than it otherwise would have been, just simply because of everything that we're all going through.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think, look, I have yet to find somebody who will argue that plastic waste is a good thing. And I think that the current situation has further shined a light on the fact that there are a lot of great use cases for single-use plastic. I think it doesn't necessarily change the need for how to deal with those single-use plastics and how to deal with innovation more broadly. I think it's also shown a light on the fact that plastic bag bans are not enough, and we can't rely on some changes like that from a regulatory perspective to really totally change the calculus, because as we're seeing, a lot of municipalities are putting those on hold, they're stepping away from them, and whatnot. And so it really, I think, talks to the need, again, across the value chain for innovation as it relates to how plastics are made, how plastics are consumed, and how plastics sort of meet the end, are handled at the end of life. And then actually, if you don't mind, just taking a step back to the other point or question that you said was out there, and I didn't even realize that those questions are there because they're coming through you. But I would just point to National Geographic as well, National Geographic Society, that's been doing a lot of work around education in the plastic waste space to raise awareness. And one of the things that we've been working with them on is helping them build out a curriculum that could potentially be delivered through classrooms to help really raise awareness around some of the challenges of plastic waste.
Yeah, education, obviously, educating the future generations who will get involved in, hopefully tackling the solution as well. This problem as well. Thinking about that in terms of engagement, you did mention, working with peers in your industry. So just curious, have you seen that the fact that you have both taken bold stances on this challenge has influenced other peers in your industries as well to do so?
Oh, there's a lot of interest in this space across the industry that we're in. There's no question about that. And that's true as I think about a trade association in Europe called CEFIC that represents chemical companies there. There are issue teams that are developing positions as part of the public policy process, and this within the context of the solutions that we as an industry either have or are working towards on enabling a circular economy. And so there's a lot of engagement across the peer set. In Europe, that's also true here in the US. And then I mentioned the Consumer Brands Association. I mean, you're going not just for the chemical industry, but you're looking at the brand owners as well as partners in that process, because the slide I showed earlier, they have a real interest in making some progress here because they make commitments that their consumers, their customers care deeply about, and they want to make sure that they meet those commitments. And so there's going to need to be partnership and able to do that. And I just want to piggyback on what Matthew said earlier about municipalities, and that's true here in the US, and then you think about what's going on in Europe. The recycling infrastructure is going to need to be part of this discussion. There's going to need to be innovation there, and we are engaging with them. I think the industry is engaging with them, and they're very welcoming and accepting of that engagement. And so that's part of this process as well.
Yeah. And I would just say, much like we did over 10 years ago when we took a big stand and created the Global Sustainable Finance Group at the firm-wide level and really kind of went out there on sustainability and the future of sustainable finance. I guess and since then, obviously, we've seen the conversation broadly across financial institutions really kind of come alive. And I would say that, as it related to the plastic waste resolution and the commitment there, very proud and happy about the support we've seen from our senior management from the get-go to really identify and tackle that and really make a bold stand on as a financial institution, as you said, the first major financial institution to have a commitment to really take that stand.
Great, absolutely. And then there's a specific question here about, we spoke about regulators, but do you know of any effort of regulators to make financing costlier for plastic production companies? So essentially to help speed up innovation through the use of capital on the regulatory side. Have you seen any impact there?
I have not, though I would say, I would just say that the conversation around regulation, as you pointed out, is increasing, but I have to date not seen a specific, any sort of specific chatter about that.
Yeah. Okay, great. In terms of other questions here, I'm just scrolling through. We've had quite a few, so thank you so much for sharing those. Please share them in the last 5 minutes as well. There's a particular question for Eastman here about the Department of Energy's bottle initiative working to derive fuels from plastics. Greg, do you have any experience with that? Is that something you would want to speak to?
That's not something I personally have experience with. We are engaged with a number of government entities as we think about the technologies that we have, and again, where the feedstock is going to be. But plastics to fuels or something like that is not something that we're directly involved with at this point. This is really more about the technologies that I've spoken about, carbon renewal and polyester renewal. Neither of those are to fuel; it's to products, like we were showing on that slide.
Great. All right, well, to wrap it up, I think we've spoken to quite a few important key points. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Matthew, for sharing them. Do you have any final comments that you would say in terms of what you hope to see to really push this transition forward?
I'm happy to start and give the last word to Greg. So I guess just in closing, I would say thank you again for hosting this. I think when we talked about the level of interest in this webinar, and frankly the level of interest we're seeing across our client segments and across news stories and population, I think that as this conversation continues to increase, and I do believe that the conversation will continue to increase, I think you're going to start seeing more and more solutions coming to the forefront. I think it's going to have to be, I think, as I said, not a single solution, and there is a lot of opportunity here for innovation and for expansion and for scale. And I'm really excited about what the future holds. This is a massive systemic challenge. It is complex. It is hard, and it's going to take a lot of really active ideas, imagination, and exploration to achieve it. And so, thank you very much for hosting this and for convening and for all the work that you are doing, and Greg as well on the Eastman side. I think the innovation and really helping move the ball forward at a large scale, at a practical scale, at a scale today, I think is really important. So I'll just end by saying thank you.
Thank you for that, Matthew, and very much agree with the comments that you just made. And if I had one point that I wanted to reinforce, it's just excitement. We're excited about where we're headed here. We're excited about the opportunity to address this. It is complicated. It is going to be difficult. There are a lot of challenges, but there's opportunity here for us to address this in a way that we'll all be proud of. And that's the excitement that we have at Eastman, is to contribute to that solution, and we think we're moving in that direction. We've made good progress, and there's more to make, but excited about where we're headed. So again, thank you to Datamaran and specifically Susie, to you for hosting this, and really appreciate everybody that decided to spend some of their time with us today talking about this subject.
Well, thank you both for sharing your expertise. Really important to have those two different perspectives in one conversation. So really valuable. I learned quite a bit as well. So just in terms of next steps for everyone online, as I'd mentioned earlier, we're going to be sharing a recording of this webinar, so you have it to refer back to. Please give us some time to just get that recording edited and summed up for you. But in terms of some key takeaways, I think we summarized those as already, but really, think about a systemic approach. Think about how you can use your financial capital if you happen to be in a similar position to Matthew, and think about the different technologies that already exist and can just be adapted to really drive solutions from a more engineering point of view, but also in terms of informing your decision making and capturing reliable information. We have resources available to you to support you on your journey. So if you want any more information, please do get in touch with us. Here are the ways you can get in touch with us, but we'll be sending you an email shortly with the recording from today's webinar and some key takeaways. So thank you everyone for calling in, spending some time with us. Hope that you have some valuable insight to take back to your businesses. And stay safe and well.